For 6 centuries, one empire waged continuous wars against kings, sultans, republics, crusaders, rebels, and rising European powers alike. They relentlessly conquered nations, endured the loss of others, redrew their borders countless times, navigated through profound crises, and kept a formidable army marching from the heart of the Balkans all the way to the Arabian Desert. And through all these monumental endeavors, they achieved something almost no other empire in history ever managed to pull off. They didn't go financially bankrupt in the process. Because the Ottoman Empire didn't just fight war. They ingeniously found a way to finance war, endlessly and sustainably. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history intricately collide, and where nothing is ever truly as simple as it first appears. The Ottoman Empire spanned a remarkable period from around 1299 to 1922. A duration longer than the storied Roman Empire, longer than the vast British Empire, and indeed longer than almost any other state typically discussed in modern historical narratives. But its sheer longevity, while impressive, isn't the most intriguing part. The true mystery lies in understanding how an empire that was almost constantly embroiled in conflict managed to avoid collapsing under the immense financial pressure that warfare inevitably brings. Western viewers often mistakenly imagine that empires fall because they lose pivotal battles. However, military defeats in themselves do not bankrupt nations. It is budgets that do. Leaders make choices that do. Logistical failures cause it. The Ottoman Empire grasped this fundamental truth early on, and instead of adopting a conventional tax and army system similar to Europe's kingdoms, they forged something far more efficient and revolutionary, a self-sustaining machine where the act of war could effectively pay for itself. But before we delve into the intricate mechanisms of this system, we need to establish a clearer understanding of what the Ottomans actually were, because for many Western audiences, the empire remains a rather vague idea. A collection of cinematic images featuring turbans, sultans, majestic domes, and the feared Janissaries. While these visual cues are familiar, the centuries-long financial and organizational engine that powered them is not. So let's slow down, step in, and meticulously set the stage. The Ottomans began their journey as a relatively small frontier principality in northwest Anatolia, under the leadership of Osman I, a shrewd warlord commanding a few thousand skilled riders who possessed an uncanny talent for being in precisely the right place at the right time. As the once mighty Byzantine Empire began its slow, inevitable crumble and Mongol power receded from the Near East, Osman's followers found themselves perfectly positioned to carve out and expand into new territories. Their early victories were far more than just military successes. They were significant financial windfalls, because every single conquest brought with it valuable land, abundant resources, essential crops, new sources of taxes, and fresh populations from whom to extract revenue. And that, fundamentally, is the first key to truly understanding the Ottoman financial system. From day one, warfare wasn't merely a cost. It was strategically designed as an income stream. By the time the Ottomans captured the significant city of Bursa in 1326, and later crossed into Europe in the 1350s, they had definitively evolved beyond being a mere frontier tribe. They had become the undisputed rising power, strategically controlling the critical trade routes that connected Europe and Asia. A position which, in medieval economics, was akin to holding an absolute monopoly on the world's vital commercial arteries. Virtually every merchant who traveled from Venice to Persia, from Cairo to Budapest, or from Baghdad to Istanbul, had no choice but to pass through the Ottoman toll gate. This strategic control mattered immensely because successful warfare fundamentally requires 3 essential things: food, metal for weapons and armor, and men. The Ottomans didn't necessarily possess a greater abundance of any of these resources than their immediate neighbors, but they possessed something even more crucial: consistent and robust cash flow. Their expansive empire was strategically built upon the richest crossroads of the entire pre-modern world. Silk from the east, exotic spices, exquisite carpets, powerful horses, crucial weapons, valuable timber, precious sugar, essential copper. Virtually everything of value moved through their vast territory. And every single time something moved, the Ottomans levied a tax on it. However, a strong revenue base alone is not enough to explain how the empire managed to pay for centuries of relentless campaigns stretching from the formidable walls of Vienna all the way to the rugged mountains of Yemen. This is because almost every empire throughout history has possessed some form of revenue, yet the vast majority still eventually collapsed under the crushing weight of military costs. What truly made the Ottomans different was fundamentally structural. They meticulously designed a sophisticated financial system that ingeniously transformed their entire army into a remarkably self-financing institution. This is precisely where our story shifts its focus from mere geography to intentional design, specifically to one of the most important, yet often misunderstood, innovations in all of Ottoman history: the Timar system. Imagine, if you will, a government striving desperately to avoid the single biggest cost of all: military payroll. Modern states, for instance, spend literal fortunes on professional soldiers. Salaries, sophisticated equipment, horses, pensions, and healthcare. Militaries invariably drain national budgets. The Ottomans brilliantly solved this perennial problem by simply refusing to pay their soldiers in traditional cash. Instead, they compensated them in rights. A Timar was, in essence, a designated tax district. A soldier, typically a cavalryman known as a sipahi, received the explicit right to collect taxes directly from a specific village or region. In exchange for this valuable right, he was obligated to fully equip himself, maintain his horse, and reliably show up for military campaigns with proper armor and weapons. He didn't receive a fixed salary from the central treasury. He funded himself directly from the land. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most ingenious pieces of financial engineering ever conceived in world history. The state drastically reduced its direct military expenses. The soldier, now invested directly in local prosperity, became a proponent of local stability, because stable, thriving villages meant consistent and stable taxes for him. The peasants, in turn, lived their lives under a predictable local authority. And the empire, through this system, possessed a vast army that could mobilize quickly and efficiently without ever emptying the central treasury. Imagine if today's government compensated a soldier not with a monetary salary, but with the explicit right to collect taxes from an entire county. If that notion sounds potentially dangerous, you are certainly right to think so. But in the 1300s and 1400s it worked spectacularly well for the Ottomans. It fundamentally transformed the Ottoman army into a potent, tax-powered military machine. And, crucially, it achieved something even more significant. It meant that Ottoman warfare was remarkably cheap to conduct. Europe at the time, in stark contrast, relied heavily on expensive, feudal knights or highly demanding mercenaries who invariably required payment up front. If a European king ran out of money, his army very quickly ran out of loyalty and disbanded. The Ottomans simply did not have that problem. Their soldiers' funding flowed consistently, even during times of peacetime. For them, war didn't strain the state budget. Instead, it simply activated the already self-sustaining Timar system. But the Timar system, for all its brilliance, wasn't the only mechanism that allowed the Ottomans to fund 6 centuries of continuous conflict. They possessed another profound innovation, one that Western audiences often know by name, but very rarely understand in its full financial context: the Janissaries. And their unique funding model was an absolutely core part of the Ottoman financial engine. But that particular story requires a crucial shift, from cavalry funded by taxes to infantry funded by something far more controversial and unprecedented. To truly understand the second key piece of the Ottoman war financing engine, we need to look closely at the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that foreign adversaries feared, Christian populations often resented, and sultans trusted more deeply than their own families. They were highly professional soldiers, exceptionally disciplined, rigorously trained from youth, and fiercely loyal to the state alone. In European military terms, they represented the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a modern Marine Corps. But what truly made them financially unique was the specific, ingenious way the empire acquired and funded them. The Janissaries were sourced through the devshirme system, often referred to as the child levy. In Christian villages scattered across the Balkans, young boys were carefully selected, forcibly removed from their homes, converted to Islam, and subsequently educated in the empire's specialized military schools. They were meticulously trained, thoroughly indoctrinated, and molded into a distinct class of professional soldiers who owed everything, their allegiance, their lives, exclusively to the state, not to their former tribes, not to local landlords, and not to specific regions. Now, the ethics of this system are decidedly not the primary focus here. It was undeniably harsh and coercive, and we absolutely should not romanticize it. But from a purely financial perspective, it achieved something that no other empire in history had managed. The state acquired a highly trained, elite fighting force without paying the high upfront cost of raising, training, and equipping men from birth. While the empire certainly invested heavily in Janissary education and their upkeep, the initial economic burden of raising these children to adulthood was effectively outsourced to the conquered Christian populations. This ingenious arrangement meant that the Ottoman Empire obtained fully formed, ready-to-serve soldiers without incurring the lifetime expenses that would typically bankrupt a treasury. And once these dedicated soldiers entered active service, they were indeed paid and housed, but they were also strictly prohibited from marrying or owning businesses during their early centuries of service, a clever measure that prevented conflicts of interest and ensured the state maintained absolute control over their loyalty and focus. If the Timar system brilliantly transformed the cavalry into a self-financing force, the Janissary system, in turn, transformed the infantry into a highly efficient, remarkably low-cost professional corps. Combined, these two complementary systems formed a military structure that saved the empire untold amounts of money over its 6 centuries of existence. But the Ottomans didn't stop their financial innovations there. They perfected something even more powerful and fundamental, ensuring that war quite literally paid for subsequent war. Whenever the empire successfully conquered new territory, it didn't just gain a new landmass. It gained new taxpayers, new Timar grants, new and lucrative trade routes, new strategic ports, and entirely new revenue streams. In essence, every single conquest strengthened the financial foundation for the very next military campaign. While a typical European kingdom might win a war and return home financially poorer, the Ottomans often returned significantly richer. This dynamic was the absolute heart of their long-term survival strategy. It wasn't just strategic military planning. It wasn't mere luck or divine favor. It was fundamentally consistent and abundant cash flow. Consider the Ottoman Empire's unrivaled geography. It strategically straddled the critical Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the ancient caravan routes leading deep into Persia and Central Asia. If you desired to move valuable goods from Europe to Asia or vice versa, you paid the Ottomans. Silk from distant China, precious spices from India, exquisite carpets from Persia, you paid the Ottomans. Venetian merchants, Arab traders, Balkan caravans, North African fleets. They all inevitably passed through the empire's extensive network of toll booths. This incredibly efficient system worked so well that by the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire had ascended to become one of the wealthiest and most formidable states on earth. While warfare was certainly an expensive endeavor, the immense profits generated from trade were even more lucrative. And the empire meticulously built sophisticated financial systems specifically designed to tap into that profit directly. One such system involved state monopolies. Certain essential commodities such as salt, tobacco, coffee, and sometimes even soap were controlled directly by the state. These goods were fundamental for daily life, which meant that the money generated from their sale flowed predictably and reliably into the imperial treasury. This is precisely where the story begins to sound eerily modern, because these state monopolies are the clear ancestors of today's strategic national industries. Think of the colossal role of oil in Saudi Arabia. Think of the critical gas pipelines in Russia. Think of the vital Suez Canal in Egypt. Every successful empire or great power requires a stable revenue anchor. For the Ottomans, these state-controlled monopolies were the closest thing they possessed to a perpetual income-generating machine. Another shrewd financial strategy was the judicious use of tribute and the establishment of vassal states. Many regions, geographically stretching from Crimea to Wallachia, paid significant annual sums to the Ottoman treasury in exchange for imperial protection or a degree of internal autonomy. It proved far more cost-effective for the empire to accept tribute than to incur the direct administrative and military expenses of governing these distant regions. And the substantial income generated funded essential state needs like soldiers, roads, fortresses, and naval fleets. But the real brilliance and, ironically, the eventual inherent weakness of the Ottoman financial system was its remarkable ability to delay, for centuries, the desperate need for external borrowing. For many hundreds of years, the empire meticulously lived within its means. Warfare was financed not by debt, but by land grants, lucrative trade tolls, tribute payments, wartime plunder, and the profits from state monopolies. There was no spiraling national debt, no giant bond market draining the central treasury, and no foreign lenders dictating the empire's fate or policies. That enviable financial independence, however, did not last forever. By the late 1600s and 1700s, the global world had profoundly changed. European powers embarked on rapid industrialization. Their armies swiftly adopted revolutionary new technologies. Crucially, their vast trade networks shifted dramatically across the newly explored oceans, completely bypassing the traditional Ottoman land routes that had once been the empire's lifeblood. Suddenly, the empire could no longer reliably count on caravan taxes and trade tolls to finance its massive military. Worse still, the venerable Timar system, once a pillar of strength, began a slow and irreversible decay. Local tax holders increasingly abused their power, centralized oversight weakened considerably, and the reliability and effectiveness of the Timar-funded soldiers declined significantly. Then came the Janissaries, who also transformed from asset to liability. Over the centuries, they gradually gained immense political influence, accumulated vast wealth, and secured numerous privileges, until they effectively became a powerful state within a state. Their entrenched financial independence and formidable political clout rendered them virtually impossible for the sultans to control. They fiercely resisted necessary reforms, became an increasing drain on the imperial treasury, and eventually emerged as one of the biggest and most intractable obstacles to the empire's vital modernization efforts. When the empire finally, and perhaps belatedly, began adopting European-style armies, they found themselves needing something they had successfully avoided for centuries: consistent cash salaries for their soldiers. And to fund that monumental shift, they inevitably turned to something even more dangerous and ultimately ruinous: foreign loans. Throughout the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire began borrowing heavily and extensively from European banks, often at exorbitant interest rates. The very same European powers it had once skillfully outplayed and dominated now, ironically, controlled its fragile finances. A massive debt spiraled out of control. Payments consistently fell behind. In a deeply humiliating turn of events in 1881, the empire was forced to hand over complete control of its financial administration to an international commission run predominantly by France and Britain, a truly ignominious end to centuries of fiercely guarded financial independence. It's a depressingly familiar pattern. Isn't it? A great power rises to prominence and strength on the back of shrewd financial discipline, then holds itself together for centuries with innovative and adaptive systems, only to dangerously ignore early warning signs of decline, and ultimately collapses when its fundamental economic underpinnings stop working. Which inevitably brings us to today. If you perceive the Ottoman financial system as merely an ancient, archaic relic, I urge you to look around at the contemporary world. You will find that these very same underlying mechanisms still exist. They are simply wearing modern clothes and operating on a vastly different scale. The old Timar system, for instance, functions today in the form of government contracts and highly privatized military logistics. Modern states frequently outsource enormous parts of their military operations to private companies, thereby strategically reducing direct payroll burdens in much the same way the Ottomans once did with their sipahis. Trade tolls have evolved into the complex modern struggle for control over vital global shipping lanes and critical energy routes. From the strategic Strait of Hormuz to the geopolitically contested South China Sea, whoever controls a crucial choke point ultimately controls the immense revenue that passes through it. State monopolies live on vigorously through powerful national oil companies and vast sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Aramco, for example, plays precisely the same foundational role the Ottoman salt monopoly once did, just on an unimaginable scale of trillions instead of mere millions. The principle of conquest paying for conquest still very much exists in the form of today's resource-driven wars. Countries now pursue territory or influence not primarily for abstract glory or ideological expansion, but for tangible assets like crucial energy reserves, vital minerals, strategic pipelines, and indispensable geographical positions. And late-stage borrowing, the very downfall of the Ottoman Empire, echoes profoundly today in modern national debt crises across the globe. Many states continue to fund their persistent deficits with ever-increasing loans until, inevitably, the system cracks. We see this in the stories of Argentina, Greece, and even the ongoing heated debates surrounding the national debt in the modern U.S. The fundamental financial logic of empire simply doesn't change. The uniforms, the technology, the specific players, those elements do. So what is the profound lesson we should draw from all this? Empires don't ultimately die on the battlefield. They die on the balance sheet. The Ottomans survived for an astonishing 6 centuries because their financial system was incredibly disciplined, remarkably efficient, and brilliantly designed to continually transform war into revenue. They eventually collapsed when that intricate system fundamentally broke down, when territorial expansion stopped paying for itself, when vital trade routes bypassed their once dominant territory, when their professional soldiers became prohibitively expensive to maintain, and when the empire borrowed so much money that foreign creditors effectively owned its very future. And that, truly, is the deeper, more timeless warning embedded beneath their extraordinary story. Financial systems possess the incredible capacity to sustain power for centuries, but only until the inevitable day they can no longer do so. History doesn't precisely repeat itself, but if you don't take the time to understand its intricate lessons, it will crush you all the same. If this analysis gave you a new perspective on history and finance, please consider hitting the subscribe button. History has the profound answers, and I'll show you exactly where to look for them.